We've had some interesting conversation already where we're talking about the fact that justice is not a standalone thing, that justice is fundamental for a whole lot of things that concerns society. And in this session, we want to dig a little deeper to see those intersections, to see the important role justice plays in businesses, in safety and security issues, on migration, social cohesion, and how the people on the stage have experienced this in their everyday life. Because we want to make sure that our conversation is evidence-based, that we are talking about what we know, what we feel, what we've seen, and what we've encountered. And I am really honored to have an excellent set of individuals for this conversation. So, just to my right is Iyinoluwa Aboyeji. There's a lot of ways to describe Iyin, and he doesn't like when we talk about him this way, but I'm going to embarrass him a little bit. Iyin is renowned for co-founding Andela and Flutterwave. Now, these names might not mean a lot to you, but Flutterwaves currently is about the biggest online payment platform in Africa. And he did it before he was 30. I can go on and on, but the other part I want to mention, so that, we go out for dinner with him, give him the check, is that he was Forbes 30 under 30 honoree. And that's not an easy feat for somebody who started off at a very young age, built up businesses. So, by any chance you guys are out for a drink, stick him with a check. Yeah. Next to Iyin is Lieutenant General. Yes, I have to say that. Retired, but they say always retired but not tired. Kees Matthijssen, a distinguished Dutch. Would you guys let me finish singing their praises before you clap? He's a distinguished military leader with over 4 decades of service. He's held commands in Iraq, Afghanistan, Mali. He was the first commander of the UN mission, MINUSMA, in Mali. And I tell you, that's not an easy job. But he comes here with a lot of understanding of what it means to secure people. And he'll be bringing that perspective to this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And next to him is Megan Price. Megan is an international security and rule of law specialist with over 15 years' experience in research, analysis on stabilization policy, programming in conflict-affected settings, and he currently serves as the head of the conflict research unit at Clingendale Institute in The Hague. Megan, thank you so much for being here with us. And to my sister, Sylvia Namubiru Mukasa. She's a Ugandan lawyer and a human rights advocate. She serves as the executive director of the Legal Aid Service Providers Network, which coordinates over 50 NGOs offering free legal services across Uganda. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for being here. And so, this is how we're going to do it. Each of the panelists is going to go up to that podium and give 8 minutes opening statement. After that, they will come back and we'll have a conversation. And I'm also using my fiat as the moderator to say I'm going to invite, everybody in the audience to contribute to this conversation at some point. I mean, we have an opening question for them, but it's not a question, but something to at least frame their intervention. And so the first to go up to the podium is Iyinoluwa Aboyeji. And Our question for Ian is why thriving economy and business opportunities need justice and strong justice system. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. In Nigeria, we would say you can clap if you want to clap. Thank you very much. My name is Iyinoluwa Aboyeji. Most people can't pronounce that today. You can just call me E, just so that we can get through to business. Very quickly, I want to talk very briefly about economic justice, which is a key issue, even as I respond to that brilliant question by Uncle Udo, as I fondly call him. But it's important to talk about economic justice without talking about my relationship with HiiL, which has spanned a decade. HiiL was one of the first institutions on the ground in Nigeria that paved the way for the technology revolution that birthed the $2 billion companies that I was introduced as founding, now $3 billion companies that I was introduced as founding. Because at the time, this was back in 2014, there wasn't really a concept of how you would build a global technology business from a place like Nigeria, which is where I've done most of my life's work. In fact, most people would have told you it was impossible, and there were lots of very good reasons why it was impossible, core of which was the absence of a justice system and a legal system that investors could trust. And I remember Odunayo Longe, who used to run the program in Nigeria, was one of the first few people to sort of integrate herself into the ecosystem as a legal expert to help guide us on how we navigated that challenge. And it is in that absence of that key factor of a justice system investors could trust and that could govern the relationships between founders and businesses that wanted to go global, that we invented a hack together. And this hack has defined the ecosystem for a decade. And the hack was we would incorporate our businesses in Delaware, because in the absence of a local justice system, we had to adopt one. And we chose America, that bastion of, justice. I mean that a little tongue-in-cheek, so forgive me if you're American. But what that meant was, as we built billions of dollars in value, the money stayed stuck in foreign bank accounts. And ultimately, as the value grew, the benefit of the value, the billions of dollars of value that were created, ultimately stayed in America. And while I'm very grateful for the experience I've had over the years, it is one of the few things that I regret, and I continue to pay for those sins today. But moving into the topic, it is so important for us to design systems of economic justice because those are the channels for opportunity. At the end of the day, even if you have human rights, if you do not have access to opportunity, you lack the instruments to sustainably defend your human rights. It is someone who has money that can ensure that when their rights are taken away, they can defend it. And that leads me to a second story, which is what happened in 2020. One of the most defining moments for the entire tech ecosystem happened in October of 2020, when a group of young people decided that the biggest justice issue, which they had been trying to confront in peaceful manner over the last, at that point, 6 years of being in the ecosystem, they had to take the bull by the horns. And it was in many ways akin to an Arab Spring moment for Nigeria, and that is the End SARS protest. You see, as we built the ecosystem and more young people started to take to the digital economy, Delaware companies, and the internet to find economic justice and opportunity, what ultimately ended up happening was their primary identity was that they would carry a laptop, which, because of a broken local justice system, the police, which was supposed to be protecting their rights, would weaponize and use as an instrument of harassment for them. And one day, the young people got up and said, enough is enough. We must end this criminal police unit which harasses us and extorts us. And they blocked a major bridge for a period of 10 days. And unfortunately, lives were lost in an execution massacre that happened at the end in order to bring the protest to an end. But the magic of that protest was it was entirely self-organized via the internet. It was young people who had now been economically empowered through remote jobs and crypto, funding a protest to protest something that mattered to them. No NGOs, no foreign influence, nothing, but young people with the income and the internet essentially pushing for an end. And they were very successful. The state capitulated. The state ended this criminal squad called SARS and gave a lot of concessions. However, because they weren't properly organized to take advantage of the moment, the desire for return petered out, an execution squad was sent in to execute protesters, and ultimately the flame died. But it just points to the need for justice and how economic justice actually does give people the resources and tools they need to be able to defend their human rights in more sustainable ways, more self-organizing ways, devoid of external political influence and other ills. I recognize that my time is up and we have a lot more to get through, but just in final passing, at the very core of designing a new economic justice system is really ensuring that we design new frameworks that can work well with the internet to ensure that technology, which is by default fair to all, enables us to be able to define clear rules for creation, for collaboration, and for conflicts around capturing value. And ultimately, if we are able to create this internet justice system, perhaps we don't need a justice guarantee from the United States and Delaware anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. It is just important, the point you made about how this huge resource you guys have created is domiciled in the United States. All it would have taken for it to be in Nigeria is that Nigeria had a justice system that could guarantee some certainty of rules, and those resources would have been there. And for the kind of economy we have, that would have been a game changer. And so this is a clear example of the failure of justice, denying a country such a huge opportunity. Thank you for bringing that up. So I'll come to you, Sylvia. Again, the defining question is how justice impacts social cohesion and the well-being of people and communities. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and for giving me this opportunity to speak before the eminent people on this topic of how access to justice impacts social cohesion and well-being of people. I must note that there is a nexus between access to justice and social cohesion, especially where people seek remedies to resolve disputes in order to live in harmony and in peaceful coexistence. So if people have remedies that are effective and they believe in them, then you are assured of social cohesion, because social cohesion is the emotional, positive emotional connection between the people and their communities. In a country where I come from, which is Uganda, our constitution, of course, speaks that justice should be administered for and on behalf of the people, and in accordance with their norms and aspirations. And when you have aspirations, that promotes social cohesion and without undue regard to technicalities. However, in Uganda, and I must speak about HiiL, HiiL having done a lot of research in Uganda and giving us data and innovation, you find that 80% of Ugandans, we provide legal aid, but 80% of Ugandans cannot afford services of legal aid or legal services. And yet, according again to the same research, 99, they have legal problems. And these legal problems touch their daily lives, like land disputes, gender-based violence, and then the youth being incarcerated, among others. So then if people cannot resolve these conflicts, it becomes so hard to live in harmony. And so when we speak about access to justice and how it impacts social cohesion, it means that there has to be fairness and trust in the justice systems. So then when people go to courts of law, when they go to the informal justice dispute resolutions, if they go to police and they get fairness, it means they are going to live together in harmony and they will promote each other's rights. And in undertaking that, there has to be equality before the law. Because then when there is equality and there is no classism, or those who are privileged and unprivileged, that means that they are all equal and they will be satisfied and they will be able to promote the wellness of each other. But where we find that there is no equality before the law, you will find instances of gaps, like mob justice, taking the law in the hands, and sometimes civil strife also comes along because people feel they are not having redress before the courts of law or even in the informal justice systems. We talked about speaking about evidence and what happens in communities. Because we often work with communities, you hear in Uganda, for example, and that will speak definitely for the Global South most times, that the rich, the poor persons cannot get justice. It becomes some kind of connotation that if you are not able to have means, you don't have lawyers, you don't know the law, you don't know where to go, it is very hard for you to get justice. And that kind of attitude and thinking, in one way, creates disgruntlement within the community. In the opening ceremony, we heard about the people-centered justice as a model. And I think, of course, there is efforts to have people-centered justice, especially in terms of the models being designed in some countries like ours, like small claims, plea bargaining, mediation and ADR. But all this requires inclusivity, such that the people participate and they know exactly how best can we resolve our conflicts. And when we resolve our conflicts, what kind of justice outcome do we need? So that way, the people become part and parcel, and we minimize on the abuses, for example, power relations and power abuses. Then when we talk about, again, access to justice and social cohesion, we cannot de-alienate it from promoting human rights. Promoting human rights. When people feel they can speak, they have freedom of association, they can talk about the evils of within the community, and that the state and all other justice givers are held accountable. Once that also happens, then people know, yes, now I think we know where to go and get redress, including also other issues like social norms, which promotes empathy, respect and tolerance, taking into consideration the vulnerable, like the elderly, the youth, all that brings social cohesion because people feel they participate. I don't know whether I still have minutes. Yeah, I still have some minutes. Then lastly, I want to speak about legal empowerment. Access to justice also entails empowering people with legal information and knowing where to go, holding them by the hands, but also giving them the information to make choices. whether to go for formal or informal justice dispute resolution mechanisms. And that way, when they choose and make a choice, because they are empowered, whatever outcome that comes out of the justice system, they get more empowered. So social cohesion and access to justice, you cannot distinguish it from each other, because once there is satisfaction of what comes out of the justice system, whether formal or informal, then the people will continue to live in harmony and they will be peaceful and inclusive societies. In a nutshell, that's what I had to offer. We can continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sylvia. I take note of the point you made about disgruntled citizens. When they can't get their problem solved adequately, they get disgruntled. And when they're in that mode, social cohesion can happen. Stability can happen. So it is really, really important. Happy citizen, happy country. And for them to be happy, they need justice. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now I come to you, General. I like that term. Just to talk to us a little bit about the intersections you see between justice, security, and stability. You have the floor.
Udo, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's very a privilege to be here and to be part of this program on a very relevant theme. Indeed, justice matters. And in the first part of the program, listening to the distinguished speakers, I every now and then looked at the banner, justice matters. Yes, agree, and building better justice for growth and stability. Agree as well, but there's a context, and I would like to go into that context. And Udo in his introduction was referring to my experience, and I've been indeed in many conflict areas serving in a commanding officer's position. If there's one thing I learned in all these conflict areas that I have been, is that the large majority on this planet, I think, well, at least 95% of the population on this earth wants to live their lives in peace with their families, have their children go to school in a safe way and not having to be afraid about violence or violent actors or whatever. And that's an important starting point. And I think looking at basic needs of people, yes, of course, food and water, but a very basic need is also security. Absolutely, and that goes to, you know, being able to live your life without having to be afraid, and that's an important one. But it's not only that, and that's why my point related to this is that if you talk about security and governance and development and basic services, they influence one another. It's not just security, but if you have good governance in a country that people can trust in, then they know that there's somebody to talk to. And it's also about, you know, the accountability for security and the legitimacy of it. So that's where they influence one another. So it's not just security. And the same goes for having access to basic services or development, bringing a perspective for people and for children, you know, that they one day in time can find work and so on and so on. And everybody wants to be treated in an equal way. That's an important aspect as well. And because all these things are kind of related, I always say in our work in conflict areas and fragile areas, we need to work as closely together as possible. The comprehensive approach really matters. And I will come to that later on as well when it comes to what it takes. So in this context, yes, justice matters too. And I would say the more justice and the better justice is felt by people, the less conflicts may arise. But when we talk about justice, and in the previous session there was this conversation about it, but I want to highlight two things that I always kept in mind, because justice has two sides. There's this legal side, you know, is law providing fairness and fairness in the application of it, in the legal system and the justice system in a country. But the other side is social justice, I would say. And I've worked indeed in my final job for the UN, and I will refer to the UN definition on social justice that says it's an underlying principle for peaceful and prosperous coexistence within and among nations, or in other words, a fair and equitable society. And it's aiming to address systematic inequalities, injustices that affect groups based on factors like race, gender, class, etc. Both are important, but my point is also that social justice is something, and the elements of it, that everybody, I think, and every actor in a conflict should keep in mind. And in the same UN context, the UN has identified 5 principles in that regard. Access, ensuring that everybody in a country has access to resources, basic services, but also opportunities. Participation, opportunities for all individuals to play a role in the political, economic, social life within the community. Equity, recognition that different people may have different needs and different circumstances. Rights, protecting human rights of all individuals. And diversity, valuing and respecting differences between people, such as race, gender, and so on. And I think it's important, and that's at least what I kept in mind, it's always important to keep an eye on these principles, also when you work in other domains, like me in the security domain. And if I refer back to Mali, the UN mission is no longer there, you all know it, but in 2012 there was an uprising in the northern part of Mali. And initially it was fought and battled military. But what I learned in Mali, more than just reading about it, having my relationship with all kinds of actors, including the Azawad movement in the north, is one of the basic problems underlying to this was the fact that they felt marginalized. The Tuaregs in the northern part of Mali felt marginalized. And that goes back to social justice. Do they see and do they have the feeling that they have equal opportunities, that they have opportunities to be represented in the government and government institutions? And I think that's an important element. And then if I look at the news now, and the mission has left, and I see that the Malian government, with the support of Wagner, is trying to regain control in the north by force. If I would put myself in the shoes of the population in the north, that would not feel just. And I'm afraid that will not bring, the justice and the stability as we all think it should be there. One thing I learned is that it's always important when you work in conflict areas to understand the need and the circumstances and the dynamics of communities, of an area, of a region. And I've also learned, and I will mention an example from Afghanistan, but I've also seen it in Iraq, at the local level and within groups in society, there may be already existing habits or whatever you call it to solve issues. In Afghanistan, I've sat in what was called shuras or jirgas, in which local communities or local local leaders sit together to solve an issue, whether it has to do with crops or access to water or whatever else. They discuss it until they find a solution. So my point also is, and I kept that in mind for an external actor, be aware and understand those local dynamics and do not try to enforce something that they're not used to. That's not appropriate. I'll end up in the few seconds that I've left. I would say there are a few points that matter in terms to take into account. Justice is an underlying need, and all actors need to understand and safeguard, especially social justice. Understand local needs dynamics, comprehensive ways of working. It's important, and with that the importance of cooperation. Build bridges between organizations and across organizations and see what you can do to help one another. And leadership matters. Leadership sets the tone and builds the bridges. And sometimes there's biases, and sometimes there's egos, and there's all kinds of reasons not to do it. but it's leadership that can make a difference. I will leave it to that, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm getting a lot of buzzwords today. Better justice, less conflict. And that's an interesting way to look at it. And the point you made about listening to the locals, listening to those who live those realities, and building your solutions on what they're used to and not what you think that they need. I think it's a really, really important point. You would think, if we're talking security, we'll talk about more guns, but all your submissions is about building society and providing equal opportunity for people. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And then I come to you, Megan, to talk a bit about how justice play a role on issues of migration and conflict. You have the stage.
Thank you. So this is always the risk of being the last speaker. All of my zingers have been stolen by my very greedy co-panelists, who are all excellent and have made exceedingly good points, which I will now not try to make sound too redundant, but just to say that I've found all of your presentations to align very perfectly with also some of the points I'd like to make today. Before I start making those points, I want to put out a few caveats. I am not a lawyer, nor am I technically a migration specialist, but before I disqualify myself completely, let me just describe the role that I've been able to play in my career at the Conflict Research Unit, and prior to that at the Knowledge Platform for Security and Rule of Law, as looking at these large sectoral, large trend factors, and doing what we can do, both in international development, but also security and rule of law, where I've focused my career, to connect to how do these large tides, these large trends, compel or influence group dynamics, social cohesion, social dynamics, all the way down to the way in which they influence and compel individual decisions. And I want to kind of put it in that context because the long and the short of it is, when working in international law, humanitarian, security, development, there are these large tides, and we need to remind ourselves to retain space, retain time and attention to focusing on the very human and individual experiences, the very human consequences, the lived experiences that these tides push. So, what role does justice play concerning issues of migration and conflict? This is obviously extremely topical today, particularly as we see daily headlines with absolutely cruel clarity on the vulnerability of migrants, their exposure to maltreatment and abuse. Ultimately, to be undocumented is to be untethered from the protections of justice. It is to be unprotected, essentially. And while these comments are perhaps maybe in reference to the serious and grave developments currently happening in my native country of the United States, the lack of legal mechanisms to ensure migrant protection is a long, enduring, and very global issue. So because of that, I want to zoom in a little bit on a particular case, which I feel really well illustrates what we're trying to say today. And here I'm going to lean quite a lot on the research of my team, and in particular reference to the work of Laurens Willem and Katja Golovko and Frans Molenaar, who have done exceedingly precise and articulate research on the case I'm about to lay out. And it helps to bring in sharper focus the dilemmas and the geopolitical dynamics that are at play when it comes to designing legal responses to migration, and how those dynamics intersect with security, with governance, with economy, basically the full spectrum of public life that my co-panelists have helped me put forward today. I'm going to start with a tragic incident. This happened in October of 2013 in northern Niger. There was a convoy, a vehicle carrying 92 individuals across the desert, carrying them to Algeria, where they were expected to migrate or possibly move on from there. The vehicle broke down, and all 92 of these individuals, the vast majority being women and children, perished in the desert. And I want to take a moment for us to empathize with that experience, because that is a human experience and one we should all be able to understand the fear and the isolation that created for those individuals. This also led to a national outcry in Niger and the need to protect migrants and to reduce migrant smuggling. And this led to a law 2015, in 2015, the law is called 2015-36, and it is an anti-smuggling law, and it was adopted. And this also gave Niger a legal framework to prosecute smuggling, which provided the state with an enforcement mechanism and a framework and a mandate to align with the UN protocol against smuggling of migrants by land, sea, or air, which Niger had ratified in 2009. Concurrently, at the same time, Niger was in close conversation with the EU, and they were negotiating a €5 billion EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. 1 billion of which, 20% of that fund, was dedicated to eradicating the root causes of migration through Niger. And the former president, Mohamed Bazoum, pre-coup president, who was at the time the Minister of State in 2015, indicated in an interview that the Europeans were requesting the government of Niger to reduce the number of migrants moving to Libya. And he said very flatly, without this law, we wouldn't have a way of doing that. But it raises a question. Who was this law meant to protect? In practice, the anti-smuggling law did not focus on eradicating root causes of migration. And I'd like us all to kind of think about what would a legal justice mechanism look like? What would a legal mechanism look like if it was to attack or address the root causes of migration? Well, it didn't look like this. Rather, the law focused on what laws mostly focus on, determining what is permissible, what is punishable, what is prosecutable. The law focused on criminalizing irregular migration, cracking down on low-level drivers and guides, which ultimately led to a consolidation of the smuggling industry. And the EU, for their part, their contribution took the form of border externalization. They gave technical assistance at the central government level to create action plans on migration, and they trained police very specifically in countering human smuggling and the arrest of smugglers, the confiscation of vehicles, and so forth. And this law was put into place without the substantive consultation or input, either from communities or subnational authorities. And I'll bring this up again because it's extremely important. To quote one citizen, "This is not a Nigerian law. It is not a law that harmonizes with our morals and our customs. It was imposed upon us." And this gets to the heart of the story of why people-centered justice really must remain our focus. And here the region of Agadez helps us crystallize this, and it becomes a notable case in point. Agadez is sits the main crux between West Africa, Sahel, and the northern Algeria and Libyan countries. And this makes it a bustling hub of intra-African migration, with an estimated 20 to 30% of those individuals also having the aspiration of moving on to Europe, but 20 to 30%. After the implementation of the law in 2015, IOM recorded a 76% decline in northbound migration through Niger. And for those who judge the success of the law based on that very narrow indicator, the reduction of migrants, well, this was a huge success. But while it might be seen as the legal system being applied to a clear and desired effect, the fact was the law was not designed with the populations and the broader context in mind. And as we've heard from my co-panelists, that is so central to understanding how do we make a successful legal justice system. First, there was the collapse of a critical component of the local economy. The law in its implementation did not account for the hard-hitting economic impact of shutting down migration in that region. And this impacted not only the criminalized elements, the smugglers, the drivers, but it also impacted the depletion of a secondary market, those who hosted, sold goods, water, food, call booths to the migrants passing through this region. And these were not inherently exploitive economies. They were selling to migrants who regularly passed seasonal migration through Africa. The economy was extremely devastated in Agadez. Beyond this, beyond the economic implications, there were also serious human security implications. The economic fall was a reported reason why many young men turned to banditry in the region. And over time, the law actually exacerbated the risks of the migrants who still dared to make the journey, because smugglers now took more clandestine routes on more remote and increasingly perilous journeys, further off track to avoid border control. In 2017, a couple years after the implementation of the law, IOM actually recorded a marked increase in the number of migrants being abandoned in the desert, the very reason that the law had been received initial endorsement from the domestic authorities. It also led to corruption within the police, who now had a bigger stick to carry, and trust in law enforcement went down. It also had governance challenges, but I realize my time is running very short. Because this law was not addressing the root causes of migration and the real needs of the local communities, it put a severe pressure on local authorities' ability to gain legitimacy with their constituents. By one account, by a local authority, basically he said, they ask us, my constituents, they ask us why we work for the EU rather than for them, the people who voted for us. So here again, we want to look at the intersection between what we consider legal versus what we consider legitimate. And that legitimacy goes really to the core of the ambition that we have to bring justice, solidarity, social cohesion into a country. It should come as no surprise that with the military overturn of the government in 2023, one of their first acts was to abrogate this law. And that sent not only a signal to their local constituents that they heard and understood their needs and the unpopularity of this law, but also sent a very strong signal to the EU about the way in which they were burnishing their new sovereign credentials. I'm going to leave it at that because I'm also egregiously over time. But I just wanted to provide it as an example of the importance of what we're speaking about today.
Thank you, Megan, for that brilliant submission. It's just interesting to see that while the government is trying to criminalize migration in the name of protecting migrants, they were actually putting them out to extreme danger. And the facts and the point that the Vice President made earlier in the day about people-centered governance being a broader framework for people-centered justice, meaning that the focus of the law should be about the well-being of the people. Why are they leaving? And not punishing those who dare to leave. And I think is a very important consideration in this conversation. So thank you so much. So now we'll have some chats. I will start with you, Ian. The point you made about your business at the beginning of the day choosing to go somewhere else because the legal system and the country where you guys were based wasn't adequate strikes a chord for me, because one would then expect that the business community in Nigeria, or indeed anywhere else, will be committed in being vanguard or being part of the coalition for a justice system that works for everybody. But that has not been the experience. Could you share with us what you think could be done, especially for most of the people in this room, to find a trusted partner in the business community in fighting for justice and creating a people-centered justice system that makes their business prosper even better?
Absolutely. So when we had these challenges, I think the first step was really to try to get other business leaders to work with us to understand these challenges and to try to solve them. And I think for many of them, because the industry was new, and some considered it a threat to their existing businesses, that effort sort of fell dead in the water. And so we had to innovate, which is sort of what we're called to do. To be fair to the government, they were willing to look at new approaches. At the time, the vice president had just got into power, and he was an excellent partner in working with us. However, there were limits to what he could do without what seemed like a business consensus. Now, what we then realized was, if we continued to hope somehow that the existing business community would perhaps look at this as something for them to intervene in, we would be waiting a long time. So what we ended up doing was, of course, moving our businesses to Delaware and building out of there, and then working with the resources that were available to sort of make it happen while we built our defenses. Now, the reality is we're the only allies you would have for a justice system that works, because if you really understand the way the country sort of is designed from a business leadership perspective, very big companies are pseudo-creations of the government, either directly or indirectly. But this is an industry where the biggest players are actually largely unknown to the government until they become big and don't have the usual, ex-military or ex-large political or industrial family ties. Like we fondly say, they don't belong to Nigeria, the owners of Nigeria. So that has made for a very complicated relationship. Now, how have we navigated? We've taken the approach of creating a zone. So we've negotiated now with the government a special economic zone, which is called Itono. And the dream is for this zone to sort of act as a buffer between us and the broader justice system, where within this zone we can negotiate special rules for different kinds of business activities. It's been a fraught journey. We've been on it for 6 years, working with the government to write legislation, to establish the zone, to give us what we need, to create. We just finally managed to get capital markets recognition. It's been helpful that we're not the only ones who are trying to design a zone. So the richest man on the continent, Dangote, has literally his own zone as well, with his own rules for how he engages the government, which has proven quite helpful for him in recent times. So broadly speaking, the strategy, as far as I'm concerned, is to work to build a base of administrative law within this eternal special economic zone as it applies to businesses that are engaging in the digital economy. And then through the success of the zone, you can then have some adoption. And our historical reference there is China. When you look at how China evolved its economic justice system, it first of all started by designating these special areas where it was able to make something happen, like, Hong Kong and Shanghai and some of these other areas, Guangzhou and so on. It was out of those areas, Shenzhen, out of those areas that kind of a new Chinese economic justice reality evolved and then was now widespread across. So that's our hope, is that if we can build something with Itono, we will then be able to export those ideals to the governments.
Okay, keep the mic. So, because I want to push a little further. So I get a sense that businesses like your own, the big businesses, the big tech businesses, are confronting this challenge and trying to carve out this kind of spaces that allow them to thrive. What is happening to the small and medium-scale enterprises? What kind of solution do you think will be necessary at this point to create the space for them to thrive, given that, at least from available statistics, they constitute more than 70% of the economy?
So the reality that we are designing is really one where anybody can access it and the bar is low enough. The reality, however, is that there is a certain, like what we're building works for digital economy businesses. That's the reality. Doesn't work as well for small businesses. But however, what we think could happen is that if the bigger businesses, and I'll use Flutterwave as an example, if the bigger platform businesses are able to design into their platforms structures that allow these businesses to thrive because they are protected, then ultimately the small businesses will get the benefits. I know it's not a very popular argument, a trickle-down argument, but the reality is that to start to tinker with the way small businesses are constituted and engaged, and which, by the way, is largely ignored by most small businesses anyway, just because the cost of compliance is too high, right? Would mean a multi-year project that would ultimately slow progress down. So our compromise has been, in the case of Flutterwave, we had a lot of businesses who, quite frankly, were not compliant, and so as a result, we could not accept electronic payments for. We negotiated and said, okay, can we make it possible for people to, on our platform, get business name registrations, right? Without necessarily having to go through the entire rigor of an entire corporate incorporation process. We managed to get that concession through engagement with the central bank and so on and so forth. And then we built a business called Norbase, but now there are many other such businesses, some of which have participated in the HiiL accelerator, to then make it easy for people to just create a business name online very quickly. And now that process is stable and it works. Now, if you want to accept payments, you go on Flutterwave's platform, you create your business name, which doesn't require a lot of work, and you validate your own personal identity, and immediately you're a business. And Flutterwave provides you your first account, and you can actually do business because this is faster and better. If we were to go the route of, appealing to the National Assembly, doing this, doing that, it would take, we'll probably still be on the matter right now. So there's a lot of creative problem solving that has to be done. It's not as straightforward as, appealing to those who should do what is right, because the reality is they don't care.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can assure you, my colleague Ronald will want to have a conversation with you before you go. And General, I come to you. So you eloquently made the case that security and justice are twins. That there should be no dichotomy of the two. But we're now increasingly seeing countries employing that dichotomy. So in the United Kingdom, for instance, we want to improve our security spending. And so we want to deprioritize our development spending, of which access to justice is a key component. Same narrative in the United States. A little bit of it even happened in the Netherlands, in the debates, So what are we missing? Is there something we should be saying to governments that we're not saying? How best can we make this argument so that they understand that it's the same package and it should not be one at the expense of the other?
A very relevant question, I would say, in the time that we're living. There's not an easy answer, but the bottom line up front is we need to think comprehensively and not just focus on rearming ourselves or spending most of our money on defense. I do not ignore the fact that it is important because there's another side that is also rearming itself. And I'm not saying we have to be in balance, but this is about the credibility of our deterrence. But there's more than that. What I'm missing in the debate is indeed the use of other instruments to enhance stability in the European region. Let's focus on this European region, including diplomatic efforts. And I will give you an example. I've also worked in NATO. There has been a time that there was a NATO-Russia council that we talked to Russia, not always at the head of state level, but also more the levels below, so to say. Since a few years, it still formally exists, but it's not active anymore. And we've also had a time in the time of the Cold War, but also in the years thereafter, that we've had treaties on arms limitation, conventional and both nuclear. But despite the difficulties that there were in that time as well, there's nothing of that left as well. And that's a bit worrisome. So the message, my message indeed, is we should think of other things as well. And in terms of getting to peace and stability, and then related to the justice, what is a just peace, what is just stability? for both sides in the end, right? We shouldn't forget. And that's why I always say, I talked about this understanding. We should also try to understand the other side. I'm not saying that we have to agree, that's something different, that's a different discussion, but what I often miss is a bit that we take the time and that we show that we try to understand the other side. Because that's really a kind of fundament that you need to have before taking whatever measures.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to come to you, Megan. When you were talking about the mistakes of focusing more on criminalizing migration without dealing with the sources, the triggers for migration, do you have experiences to share or examples where indeed government has focused on those driving triggers? And do we see a difference when the approach is not criminalizing? Because even in the United States, it's the same approach of criminalizing. And there are two aspects of the challenge that I see. One is the justice need that is driving them out of their country. And the second one is the justice need that is endangering them as migrants. Are there some good examples that you have? Is that something we can learn from those examples?
No, I really appreciate the question. The challenge here is in a certain way one of timing, because so many of the ways in which criminalization mechanisms are promoted through our political processes and through our domestic legislation processes are because they are on a political timeline. They're on a very short-term timeline. So these crackdown measures that you're seeing in the United States and the examples that I've gave are timed for a sharp edge and immediate effect that can feel satisfying in a political timeline. But we have to remind ourselves that these political timelines are just blips on the radar when it comes to the long duration of actual sustainable development that is required, the long-term planning, because you cannot build up an economy and you cannot secure a society in a 4-year cycle. Like, these are long-term projects precisely because we are talking about processes of social cohesion that Sylvia so brilliantly articulated, precisely because we are talking about comprehensive approaches that Kees referred to, precisely because, well, maybe you've had better experience, but I don't think many people get to become billionaires before they're 30. And so these are long-term wealth creation prospects as well that take a long time. And so we have to resist those temptations to pull ourselves into political timelines that incentivize harsh securitization approaches. Now, there have been discussions and debates around the way in which stabilization approaches, which come in with a very hard and fast approach, can then transition to longer-term development or longer-term justice and social cohesion programs. But to be very honest, I have not seen as many as I would like to see, and I don't have a wealth of examples in terms of how those transitions happen, because they create their own incentive structures. One example here is the way in which police who are given a new and sharper authority can use that for informal taxation if they haven't been given the discipline and the security sector reform, anti-corruption training in the same time. So there you can almost perpetuate and create strong and entrenched incentives to keep these hard security approaches together. Another really egregious example, unfortunately, was the way in which many border externalization projects reached out to community groups that were forming local militias and local self-defense groups, who then saw a great opportunity to present themselves as a credible partner in border management. Some of those groups who have been the beneficiaries of these hard security programs, you might recognize today, for example, the RSF in Sudan. So we really must understand that our political timelines put us at risk of forgetting these longer-term trajectories that we have to commit to when it comes to building sustainable development, social cohesion, comprehensive approaches to economic and security development. You asked for a more positive example, and I've been kind of reaching in the back of my brain to find one. Let me actually put it forward, Schengen. Schengen. We all are benefiting from the amazing processes that creating a mobile region, creating freedom of movement within a region has allowed for economic flourishing and for social cohesion across borders. We have seen time and again when these regional approaches to allow mobility, people's mobility, to flourish, creates better economic development and creates stronger social ties across groups. ECOWAS was a previous example. It's now being threatened by the rise of frustrations with ECOWAS, for better or for ill, but also with the withdrawal of certain countries. But that was an example of where encouraged, facilitated, regulated, and well understood legal pathways for people to move within their regions actually created more incentives for people to stay in the region. So it can have the same effect. It just needs patience.
Thank you. Thank you. And I like the point to make about the artificial political timeline, which means we need results immediately. Ian, I'm going to come back to you, but first I want to go to Sylvia. You made the case in your intervention about the importance of an effective justice system, access to justice, as a tool for social cohesion, as a tool for an inclusive society. I want to hear a bit from you. How has civil society in Uganda made this case? How is government responding? Keeping in mind that you've got an active area of violence in the country, which also has to do with some of these identity crises and inclusion issues. Has government used this argument that you're putting forward to address those internal conflicts that you have in the country?
I must say the approach of civil society in ensuring that there is social cohesion, but also access to justice, has been more of empowerment. You empower the community through sensitization, awareness raising, but also bringing them to appreciate the laws in place and how to use the law to access justice. And so you'll find that many civil society organizations, especially those that are in access to justice, will always use what we call community justice approaches. You put in place paralegals, you put in place community opinion leaders, you promote informal justice mechanisms where the people resolve conflicts within their communities, using traditional methods of dispute resolution or other methods, alternative dispute resolutions. And so as a result, the community gets empowered and they know how to use the law. So you'll find that some of the researches that have been made, for example, by HiiL or even our network, you find that people are more inclined to use informal justice mechanisms than the formal justices. Because you'll find that 10% of the communities access formal justice. And usually it's because of the hurdles that have to be crossed to go to the justice system. First and foremost, it's very expensive. And then sometimes it's not affordable for the ordinary. Then there are other hurdles like technicalities, then corruption-related issues, lack of trust in the justice system. So then when the civil society empowers the community to know and use the law within their various other dispute mechanisms, then the people get a kind of satisfaction. But that's not to say that civil society has not engaged government again in terms of improving the processes of accessing justice, because whether we like it or not, we need the informal justice mechanism, but we also need the formal justice. There are certain disputes that cannot go without using the formal justice system, the courts of law, the police, and others. So what we do is to ensure that there is more advocacy towards people-centered justice. And you realize that there are reforms that are coming in terms of legislations, in terms of how business is being done, opening doors, being more accountable, in addition to other challenges, of course, that go with the justice system, but there are efforts to improve access to justice. Because we cannot talk about social cohesion when there is no positive outcomes. Usually, access to justice can impact social cohesion positively and negatively. Negatively in terms that people feel they are not getting the justice they want, and they resort to their other means of resolving disputes. So there is a working relationship. I'm speaking to the country that I come from. There is a working relationship between the formal justice, the civil society, and the government to ensure that justice is improved across board. But that doesn't go without saying that there is still a lot of hurdles to cross. There is a lot of gaps. And once people feel that there is not sufficiently addressing their needs, definitely there is that disgruntlement that comes along. Yeah, the other issue would be, of course, with investing in justice, looking at justice as more of an enabler to social, economic, and political development, rather than looking at it as a consumer. You look at it as like it is more of consuming resources than giving back. So when we look at the cost benefit of delivering justice and ensuring that people are accessing justice, there is a lot of benefits that come out of it, including economic, social well-being, peace and security, among others. Yes.
No, thank you. That's something you said that I'm sure resonates with me and most of my colleagues here, is the approach. Empowering people to enforce their rights, empowering people to use the systems properly, as well as engaging with government. And so as you're building the system up there, you are enabling people to make demands and to provide alternatives to what they actually want from government. And that is how change happens. And I think it's a very powerful point you're making. I'm going to come to Ian, who wanted to make an intervention, but I want to open this up for questions. Do we have the microphone going around now? Okay. So I want to open this up for questions, comments, disagreements. By the way, you don't have to agree with everything. So if there are dissenting voices, please do know that we are people-centered. We want to hear your dissents. But Ian, do you want to quickly react to Megan's point and then?
Absolutely. There was the point you made about positive stories about how softer approaches to migration have yielded the right kind of outcome. I really want to use, there are certain interventions that have been sponsored by the EU as well as Canada in those respects, where simply by having young people redirect their energy from trying to illegally migrate to actually acquiring the skills to legally migrate, you've seen quite a bit. For example, Andela, which was the first company that I built, is basically, a talent accelerator. So we identify talented young people, train them in software engineering, other digital skills, and then place them with companies where they worked remotely for 2 years. I often joked that if I wanted to have an Andela reunion, I'll have a better chance of doing it in Amsterdam than I would in Lagos, which is a sad commentary on how many of them have migrated, but I don't think of that as a bad thing because there's a lot more where those came from. But I think about it more from the perspective that, simply by these young people are young people who would have been prime candidates for human smugglers and the likes, human trafficking groups and all of that. But simply by putting in the time and effort, which young people are actually very much willing to do, to learn skills that are valuable for the society they are migrating into, they're able to come into the society and take up jobs that, quite frankly, society is finding it difficult to fill. So I just wanted to give that example so that it's not all bad.
That's a very good, very positive example. And I'm sure the MFA is listening. Maybe something will happen very soon. Yeah, so I see no hands, one hand. Okay. Just introduce yourself and then make your intervention.
Thank you for this enriching panel discussion. My name is Annelie. I'm a student of Leiden University. The two things that really spoke to me were social cohesion and social justice. My question is mainly targeted at Ms. Sylvia and Mr. Kees. Children are often left out of the discussion. Children in many domestic jurisdictions don't have legal standing. Yet their support is also necessary for accessing social justice. How do you reflect on the role and involvement of children in supporting legal empowerment? Yeah, that's my question. I hope it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, so Sylvia first, and then.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So we can get the microphone to you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that interesting question concerning children and involving them in access to justice in order to promote social cohesion. My approach would be, of course, children are very important in terms of ensuring that their well-being is maintained, what we normally say the best interest principle for children, that in every decision the caretakers or administrators are making, the best interest should be the priority and overriding factor. However, oftentimes in determining matters related to children, the adults or the caregivers or the administrators tend to think that children are not yet there to make a decision for themselves. So it is always encouraged that we look at the evolving capacities of these children and growth to be able to determine, and we involve them in terms of making a decision. That is, if they can be able to decide. However, if you are in the decision-making position and you think that this child is not yet ready to make a decision, then think through the current, the future, and you make a decision that would impact on this child positively, a best interest for life. You are deciding and you are looking and saying, if this child was old enough to take a decision, what kind of decision would they make? That then makes it very important that in future, even when they are there, they see that their well-being was catered for and they will have no regrets. And of recent, of course, within the well-being of the children, there are many issues that are affecting children, child delinquency, but also the issue of drug use, substance abuse, children being kept under incarceration, sometimes with adults. So it is a whole lot of thought process based on the circumstances and case by case to determine how children's well-being is considered, because at the end of the day, they are the future. And social cohesion depends on them. If their childhood is not dealt well with, then the future is not bright for everyone. Thank you.
Maybe from my perspective, just to add a few remarks. First of all, I think absolutely a fair point. You know, children have the same right to social justice, at least. You know, including access, for instance, to schools, to basic services, etc. That is one side of it. In this case, and I've seen it in countries, unfortunately, sometimes as well, it's also depending sometimes on cultures in a country, in a region, how parents, families, communities deal with children. That's also an unfortunate reality, and that's something I think we need to be aware of. And there's, of course, always a responsibility for parents too. Yes, for the state in terms of providing, you know, things like basic services, but for parents too, I would say.
Okay, so I just want to go back to your initial answer to my earlier question about, and you made the point that we need to speak to everybody when it comes to securing the peace and responding to conflict and improving security. I wanted to just get your thoughts on this whole conversation about rule of law, global rule of law, where we are guided by rules and each country, abides by those rules. Now, I ask this question because of the way it is being redefined in current times and the huge implication that it has for justice at the country level. Because the moment you have those destabilizations at the global level, it affects the stability of countries and by extension, the functionality of justice systems. So I wanted to get a sense from you as we try to make the case that the world should pay attention to justice. How do we make the argument better for them to understand the link between the global rule-based order and the local realities of justice and how that intersects with each other?
They intersect with each other, but unfortunately in this world we always have this influence of history, culture, tradition, perspective, and sometimes the way nations are governed. I think I always use the example of human rights. There's a general declaration on human rights that I think most of the nations in this world have signed, and we can all read the text. But there's so many differences in the applications, and watch the news every day, by the way, I would say, that sometimes in time and space, nations kind of stretch what is in it, I would say. But the way nations deal with it or interpret what is stated in this agreed declaration also depends a bit on history, traditions, and culture as well. And that is one of the main challenges, I think, in this world. I think it's very good that we have this general declaration, but the application remains a challenge every day worldwide.
Yeah, that's
not an easy answer, by the way. that's clear to that.
It is, yeah. It is,
and especially if we have difficulty in holding each other accountable.
Exactly.
That's, I think, one of the main points as well. Even the UN as an organization in which most of the world is represented has a difficulty with it, but we have so much difficulty in holding each other accountable to stick to something that we all agreed upon.
Exactly. In a recent op-ed we did from HiiL, we were making the argument that justice could be a universal language. It could be something we can all agree on and work towards. At least it works for everybody. But again, like you said, the interests are varied and who knows?
No, I think it should be universal. Back to this people-centric approach, or put yourself in the shoes of the majority of this population in this world that just want to live their life in a peaceful way. From that angle, from that perspective, we should look at it.
Okay. This is your final chance to say something and appear on television? Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Marcus Manuel. I'm a senior research associate at ODI Global. I was the former advisor to the UK Minister for Development. Thank you for such a rich conversation around migration. I just wanted to invite the panel just to reflect more on where they see the positive justice interventions that could help on migration. We've heard a lot about the risk of doing harm by putting in the wrong ones. And maybe to start with the special economic zone idea, what are the core justice elements you would like to see within the justice space? What would really matter for the businesses and for that to thrive? What sort of architecture, what's the basic ecosystem you would really like to see there as a way to starting? But other panelists may want to add. Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more question and then the panelists can, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Roger Khouri. I'm a Justice Sector Advisor at HiiL. I come from Lebanon. So I have an observation. In a country like Lebanon and Tunisia, we have a high level of trust in the army, but a low trust in the justice institution. What kind of lesson we can learn from the army? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will bring it back to the panel. Anybody who wants to pick the question, but when you answer the question, please make your concluding thoughts because we are right on the mark, so we can wrap up. So take us. We'll start with the army. Okay, Megan, go ahead.
I'm going to step a little bit out of my lane here, in all due respect to the Lieutenant General. Just one remark that I think kind of touches on a couple points about, again, I want to pull back this idea of justice and legal versus legitimate. How do we understand this through a lens of legitimacy? And here, one thing that I would maybe posit as a theory, not one that I've tested myself, but in regards to your question, Roger, for me, it's about consistency. How do you build trust through consistent, disciplined response? How do you become a predictable actor in an otherwise unpredictable world? And this is what we had hoped justice to fulfill that role in society. And what we are seeing at the moment is even in areas and in countries where the justice sector is trying to play that role and provide transparent, consistent rulings, they don't have an enforcement mechanism. And therefore, those rulings don't have a consistent application. So here I would say consistency. Consistency is what we need to focus on. And indeed, in Lebanon, the army has proven itself to be a consistent and predictable actor in that way. So I would revert to that. There was another point, that Marcus brought up that I'm apologies. I'll have to come back to it when I give my brain a pause. But Kees, maybe.
I fully agree with that. And the only thing I would add, 2 words: credibility and trust. You know, within a state, the trust in security institutions and the trust in a government system and the legal system, but and you can apply that internationally as well. But also the aspect of credibility to add to this consistency, because credibility comes with consistency too. And once that gets lost, and that is what you, I think, are referring to in this world that we unfortunately are seeing, that's very difficult, and that's not the way we should go. And there's a saying in the Dutch that say it goes by horse and it comes on foot. So to get it back will be a long haul.
Yeah, Sylvia.
Yeah, I would like to say that when we are looking at justice matters, we have to look at it from the perspective on who is seeking justice. Yeah, the justice seekers. They have to come to the justice systems with different needs. So the key guiding tenets would be equality and equity. So no one is above, everyone is equal. But again, we are not homogeneous. We have different vulnerabilities. So the element of equity as justice is being given becomes a critical factor in ensuring that there is access to justice is impacting on social cohesion and well-being of the communities. So we should not look at the state-of-the-art buildings or etc., but we should look at what is the outcome. And this outcome for justice, for who? Yeah? This child that came into the justice system in contact and in conflict with the law, what were their justice needs and how did we resolve them? This elderly woman who is being evicted from their home, how best did we deliver the justice and in what timelines? So that justice then becomes meaningful and it will matter based on the individual justice seeker. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian.
So specifically to answer the question that Marcus raised about the ideas that should underpin justice for something like a special economic zone, I think it's really about designing what I would call a global justice template, such that in the absence of a global consensus in the form of Delaware, you actually do have a sense of this is what justice could look like as far as economic justice in particular is concerned. And, you know, for me, I look at it in three particular aspects. The first is really, what are the rights you have in creation, right? So when you think about an asset is IP, any kind of IP, any kind of digital or physical asset. What are the elements of that? You know, a lot of the existing justice system hasn't gone really beyond land, labor, you know, factors of production. But when you think about it from a digital economic lens in particular, things have kind of moved beyond that. Now you're talking likeness, image, ideas, and how do you make sure that, you know, there's a global justice template that recognizes that ideas and IP from developing countries must be treated the same as those from developed countries. Because right now we don't live in that world, right? IP that emanates from Netherlands is somehow more valuable than IP that emanates from Yaba.
This is intellectual property.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, intellectual property. But not just intellectual property, just all sorts of rights of creation, as I like to say. The second is technology-driven and administered justice from a collaboration element, right? So a big part of the conversation is like investors say we don't trust that when we invest in maybe a country like Nigeria, we'll get our money back out. And that's because, you know, the government can change their minds. So how do you abstract human elements from change? Because human beings are the ones who change their minds. Computers can only be programmed. So how do we, you know, in an age of blockchain and AI, actually build that in and create clear rules where we say, well, you know, you earn this NFT, for example, non-fungible token, and that represents your interest in X company. And basically, you know, that cannot be easily denied so long as it's registered on some sort of blockchain. It's really creating a platform for that to say, well, if these technologies are being used in the recognition of this right, then there should be no reason why that right should not be effected whenever it's required. And then the third thing is really a globally recognized conflict resolution mechanism. I think that a lot of the institutions for business settlement are too expensive for people to engage. And so that makes it very difficult for small businesses that want to go global to properly engage. And so it becomes a weapon only for the biggest companies in the world. For example, you know, not to go specific, but you know, we have a situation in Nigeria where Facebook takes your data from Facebook and uses it on WhatsApp to retarget you. And the EU can fine and get their money, you know, and settlements are paid if that happened to you in the EU. But if you're in Nigeria, you know, Facebook has the ability to make your country look like a dangerous investment destination simply for asking for your rights, which are recognized elsewhere. And so you have this uneven application of justice. So there has to be a way to say, Facebook, you committed this crime in X, Y, Z countries all over the world. We're not going to relitigate this issue on the basis of your resources and the resources for my government to be able to enforce compliance. It's been settled. And because it's been settled in one jurisdiction, it's been settled in all jurisdictions. And as such, we don't need to relitigate this issue on the basis of your ability to negotiate. And the same thing with pharma, right? Where we know there were drugs, harmful drugs, where settlements were paid in the US and in the EU because they have the enforcement and compliance mechanisms. But those same things in Kaduna become a drama to enforce. How do you ensure that you have a global conflict resolution mechanism that ensures that, you know, big companies are held to account all over the world, not just in the countries that have the power to hold them to account, but even in countries that don't. And my final remarks, if I'm allowed to.
Please.
Okay. I think ultimately, as we shift, you know, justice is born out of global consensus because everybody understands what fair means. By the time we have a conversation and say this and this and this happened, this and this and this happened, we can basically tell what was not fair and what was fair. And I think, but I think in a world where everybody wants to pick their definition of fair, the only hope that the common man has really is leveraging the internet and technology to determine what's fair. But that will only work if in places like The Hague we can come to a global consensus on what fair means and enforce it through the internet so that those who don't want to be, who don't want, Delaware to determine what fair is can turn somewhere else. And the world needs that alternative today.
Thank you so much. Please, a round of applause to the panelists. I can't even begin to summarize, so I'm not even going to try. But I'll leave you with two things. In a world that is unrecognizable, changing with the speed of light, we need some consistency, we need some certainty, and that is what justice provides. Justice provides consistency. Justice provides some certainty. And that kind of certainty is good for business. It is good for safety and security. It is good for social cohesion. It is good for migrants. At least that we know that there's something we can really rely on in a time there are many unreliable things happening. And that could be justice. And I guess that's why we're all here today. So, thank you so much for making the case. And we look forward to more conversations today. Thank you for being an exceedingly engaging audience. And a round of applause to you.